Alright guys, so I don't really have much time to be able to go through every single part of this presentation because there's just so much to it and I only have 8 minutes for this. So essentially what I'm going to be doing is showing you how to create a modern web application startup on a budget. So we're going to be covering the hardware that's needed, the open source software to help design and develop it, modern web stack, and then briefly discuss deploying the application to the cloud. So you're going to need some hardware to be able to do this, and the only hardware you're going to need is a computer, and I prefer a laptop because it's cheap, it's portable, and it'll help you develop the applications much quicker. Now moving on to the software and tooling, you're going to need to use some free and open source alternatives to help you stay within your budget. And the downside to using free and open source is that it can sometimes be difficult to receive support if issues arise. Now, moving on to designing the application, for the software for user interface design, I'd say use Figma because it can be used on either the browser or the desktop and is completely free. Now, for designing the logic and database, like DTT diagrams and flowcharts, I'd say use diagrams.net, which is formerly draw.io. Now, moving on to a code editor, I would say use Visual Studio Code. It's created by Microsoft and it's very fast and it has a massive community, so there are plenty of third-party plugins available. And if you're going to need to document your development, I'd say use a version control software like Git. And what Git does is keep track of your changes over time and stores your code in repositories. And then you can collaborate with other developers using Git to merge code with each other. Now, moving on to the web stack. A stack is basically a group of technologies that is used together to create a website with a front end and a back end. The common parts of a stack include a web server, a scripting language, a database, and a view. And in the past, people used what was known as the LAMP stack, which had a Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. But nowadays, we're moving towards single-page applications, so a popular choice is the MEAN stack, which uses Angular. The problem with Angular is that it's very massive, though. So it's probably not one of the best choices to use for smaller applications. Now with the MERN stack using React, it is a much lightweight, good alternative to use. Now, the MERN stack is essentially MongoDB, ExpressJS, React.js, and Node.js. And when you combine all these together, you'll create a full stack, single-page application. Now, starting with Node.js, it is essentially a JavaScript runtime that lets you run JavaScript on the server, and it uses this concept known as asynchronous programming, which is much different from PHP, where in PHP, each line of code is fired off line by line, and it waits for the line above it to be fired off before the next one goes. But with Node, everything is fired off at once, and you use callback functions to handle any kind of returns to a line of code. Now this is useful for network requests, so other code can be run around in the background while you're waiting for a network request to be returned. And if you need to use synchronous programming, you can accomplish this with the sync await feature in JavaScript. And Node.js also includes an HTTP module, which is used for creating web servers. Now there are essentially 3 different types of Node programs, but the main one we're going to focus on is a web application. It is easy to use Node.js to make web applications because the JavaScript already runs on the client side and you can reuse it on the server side to accomplish server-side rendering, which will help you with performance and SEO. Now, moving on to using Node as a web server, you'll want to implement the HTTP module, but this alone is not recommended. The reason for this is that a Node application should not be concerned with managing the SSL certificates and protocols used. For that, you should use a reverse proxy, and what that is basically a web server that talks to another web server and acts as the middleman between the client and the Node HTTP server. The most popular reverse proxy available is probably Nginx. Now moving on to ExpressJS, it is a Node.js framework that is used to quickly develop web applications. It has a lightweight design compared to Ruby on Rails, which uses a lot of boilerplate code to be able to get it up and running. And it uses a simple concept where you take an HTTP request, you coordinate and handle that request in some manner with the use of middleware, and then you return a response. Now where Express can really shine is when you use it to make REST APIs. And a REST API is essentially an application that takes HTTP requests and sends back a response in the form of JSON. And an API has different routes to perform different actions. So like if you give a GET request to get/API/users, it will return all the users in the database. But if you just want a specified user, you just give the parameter of the username and it will only return the specified user. And you can also use this to post data to a database as well. Now moving on to MongoDB, MongoDB is a NoSQL database that is both flexible and scalable. It is scalable because it has the ability to scale out, and flexible because it is different from relational databases as in it doesn't have a predefined schema. So developers can experiment with different models without needing to change the schema every time. Now, MongoDB is a lot like relational databases, as in a document is the same as a row, but a document is represented as an object. And a collection is the same as a table, as in a collection is just a group of documents. And a database can contain, of course, multiple collections, and one single instance of MongoDB can contain multiple databases. And then using the object document mapping tool, you can basically define database schemas and provide structure to your code, and basically use object-oriented programming to query MongoDB. And a good option I would use is Mongoose.js. Now, moving on to React.js, most modern web applications are moving towards this concept of single-page applications where you take all your files in one static bundle and then use JavaScript to manipulate the HTML. And then you use AJAX requests to fetch data from an API and bind that data to specified elements. And I'd say React is the most popular tool nowadays to create single-page applications, recently passing Angular in the market share. It was created by Facebook and is now basically used by everyone like Netflix, PayPal, Airbnb, and Walmart. React uses this concept known as the virtual DOM, and a DOM is essentially a programming interface structured like a tree, which gives JavaScript the ability to manipulate HTML. When an application starts to scale up, it can be pretty difficult to implement change detection, so that's where the use of the virtual DOM comes in. It's created in the client's memory, and it is manipulated instead of the DOM, and then it compares itself to the actual DOM and only updates parts of the DOM that need to be updated, which is known as heuristic diffing. This is what makes React very fast and dynamic. React uses this mental model that draws on areas of computer science like object-oriented programming. A component is a primary unit that is used for building the UIs in React and represents the piece of a UI, like a navigation bar or the links in a navigation bar. They're meant to be reusable, and they can have life cycle methods, which will let you run code when the component mounts, updates, or unmounts. And a component also has props, which is essentially like attributes that an HTML element would have, and state, which is the data that describes a component at a given point in time. The state can be manipulated, and you can take state and be sent to an API via AJAX to be stored in a database, or you can take data from an API and bound it to your state. Now, the last part, talking about deploying the application, I'd say the best way to do it is using Amazon Web Services, using an Amazon EC2 virtual server instance. You can essentially place your application in one instance and your database in another, and then using Amazon Route 53, you can manage your DNS and create a domain name to be linked to your application. And that is essentially how you'd be able to make a modern web application.